Oh, hey there. How's it going? Um, we're here to help you succeed on an interview. Um, we talked about a lot of technical stuff. Now we're going to talk about some of like maybe soft skills they might say, or they might say like culture fit, or I don't know. There's a lot of ways to assess, whether or not someone's a jerk, and it's hard too. It's hard because I think some people, they're going to act like they're really nice or something, right? But you know, maybe they're really a jerk underneath, right? It's hard to tell sometimes. Um, but these are some of the questions I get and just some of my answers. So, people might try to approach, what is your style of game development? You know, what's your kind of like, I don't know, like psychology around it or like approach? And I usually talk about how I really find that gameplay engineering is a service oriented role. You know, um, Gameplay engineers really aren't rock stars in this industry. That's the truth of it. um, you know, Even when you think about somebody who's like a really brilliant gameplay engineer, like someone like Jonathan Blow, who's got like this cult following, right? Um, the reason why he's got that renown is because he's a creative director, also, right? It's not his gameplay engineering that's usually lauded. I mean, he does have like a talk on GDC or whatever for like rewind mechanics, but people don't know him from that talk, right? Uh, the only like crazy famous gameplay engineers I could think of is like Elon Ruskin. And I mean, there's a lot of people who I look up to who are gameplay engineers, but the thing is, like, even that guy, who I would think is like top three in the world, right? You probably haven't heard of his name, right? Unless you're, into this like I am, which you probably are because you're here, right? But I mean, they're never going to approach the fame of like a John Carmack, right? Um, Even though John Carmack, at some point was an amazing gameplay engineer. Now he's doing so much more than that. Um, so at the end of the day, I'm going to say it's a service oriented role. You're there to help the content creators get their stuff in the game, and sometimes you get to play around a little bit with design. And Mark Bucciani, from Sony Santa Monica, he's the engineering manager there. He's said to me that a gameplay engineer is sort of like 50% a designer, 50% a programmer. I think it depends on what studio you're at, right? So for that studio, I don't know if that's really the case, right? It's more like, I don't know. In my experience, it's been like a gameplay engineer is like 80% to 90% a programmer, maybe 10% a designer, right? But it depends on your task and your project. But um, I think it's important to be humble in this industry, right? Because at the end of the day, everybody just wants to make a great game, and you got to check your ego at the door. And I think it's important that you communicate that in the interview because there's a lot of people, who are gonna, you know, act like Mike Acton, a really successful guy, but it's like, that approach to software development is gonna it's gonna burn people along the way. Not everybody's gonna respond very well to that. What is the most technical, complex thing you've ever scripted? I doubt they're going to say scripting, but this is the kind of question you're going to get a lot. And so it's good to just have a project on hand that you could talk about, explain the complexities, both social but really technical. You want to talk about what is a technically challenging thing you did, and in particular, something that was impressive that you did. This is such a curious question. I love it for that reason. I haven't been asked it, but it's something that I definitely wanted to figure out because I read about it somewhere, where somebody asks you, what is something you learned that was initially unintuitive? And I think if you want to really interrogate your mind, that's a great question. Something that you at first, it was unintuitive, but now, you know, this is the way that you think it's the best way to do it. I think this is an interesting answer for me at least, and it's that, when I was in university and school, they always teach you about this big O notation, right? Like n log n, big O n big omega n, um, the other one. And the truth is, for the vast majority of code, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter, like what your performance is. And that's like crazy to say, but the truth is, like, most code is not going to be on the critical path, right? it's not going to be hit every frame. And if it's like some code that like does some weird thing, like when a certain action is triggered, or if it's like a one-time event, or even better, if it's like it has the time to process because the user's in like a menu dialogue, like, dude, it doesn't matter if it's n squared or n cubed. If it's happening in like, only a few once, or you have the time to process it, it really doesn't make a difference. And so this crazy thing I realized is that the time to implement, right, maybe 5 hours to get this method coded versus 1 hour for the shitty method, the shitty code, that it runs fine, it's not sloppy, but the thing is, it's not functionally optimal, performantly optimal. Sometimes it's better to code the method that takes less time to code but doesn't run as well than to code the method that takes longer to code but it uses a little bit less memory. And I think that's something that like schools do not teach, because they're very focused on like, anyway, this is a different rant. It's a rant. I'm getting into a rant. We don't care. Moving on. How do you handle bugs? What's your debugging practices? I've gotten that question a lot. I don't know why they ask that. Because I feel like everybody just does the same thing. But I talked through one particular bug I faced and everything I did to fix it. I tried this, I tried this, I tried that. Turns out the Unity engine is just broken, and it's been so broken lately. It's really been a sad story, but that's how that story ends. And I love that, because it's like, oh man, it's not my fault. So that's always a great way to talk about a bug, right? They're like, what's the biggest bug you ever faced? Oh, this thing, and it wasn't my fault. So that's a great end to the story, isn't it? What's a mistake you made at work? This is something I'm still working on. So they're often going to ask something like, what's a big mistake you made at work? I need to work on that. And then I can think of a few right now. And then the other is, what's a big argument you had with like a manager, and how did you resolve that, right? These are questions that are very common. And then talk about a project or two. So I talk about NSA Intern because that's a big project I made recently. And then they're going to ask you, what's your favorite game, and what would you change about it? And these are my answers for Gone Home and The Beginner's Guide, some games that I really love. They might ask you about their game, right? So if it's, I don't know, if it's Naughty Dog, they might ask you, hey, did you play the latest Uncharted? You better say yeah. Okay, and well, what did you think? How could it be improved, right? You'd be surprised, though. The companies that are like the most technically focused often don't really care so much if you're a big fan of their games, right? It's games that really have like a sort of cult going on, like Riot Games. They're going to really care about whether or not you played in League of Legends. I have gotten in the interview process to the final stage, and then they ask you, hey, what's your summoner's name, right? And I'm like, oh, I don't really play League that much. And they're like, dude, you're fired, right? You're not going to get the job there if you're not like, drinking the fucking Kool-Aid, right? But I mean, different companies have different, approaches to that. So you got to be conscious of that and make sure you let them know you're a big fan of their games. One thing that I've done a lot, actually, pro tip here, is in these take-home tests that they send you, I've kind of meme-ified it, right? So I can't show you, but for the interview that I did for id Software, the Doom company, I took pictures of me and I photoshopped my face onto the Doom Slayer and called myself the Bug Slayer, and I had this picture in game of me fighting Jenkins and Jira reports, and it was really funny, and it definitely made them laugh, and that's one way to stand out, and I think it's fun, and it shows you you care about their game. And what I've also done? I've also showed the swag that I own for the game, right? So I've got a ton of Fallout swag. So when I interviewed for Bethesda, I put the Vault Boy lunchboxes behind me, and they were like, oh man, this guy cares about the game. Boom, got an offer. Was it because of that? Maybe. Might have been, right? Okay, so then they're going to ask you, hey, do you have any questions for us? And the answer is always yes. Yes, you do. We're getting into... all right, we'll squeeze that into this video. So, what questions should you ask them? Here's a bunch of really insightful questions you're going to want to figure out. How does your studio handle crunch? What's the most recent... Okay, so that could be, do you do 7 days a week crunch? Do you do 10-hour days? Explain to me specifically, what does crunch look like at your company, and what's the last time that you've crunched? What was that period like? That's something you really want to know. The other thing is you want to start asking about the studio like complexion. What percent of engineers are in the headcount? You want to be spicy? You could say, hey, what percent of engineers are women? That question's that'll kick them in the balls because it's going to be a very low percent number no matter where they are. So if you want to squeeze someone, that's a good question to ask an engineering manager. What percent of your staff are women? That's going to squeeze them. There is a few questions that are going to squeeze them that hard. You don't always want to squeeze your interviewer, by the way. Take all this with a grain of salt. Your mileage may vary. You want them to like you after all. What role does an engineer have in decision making? That's really important, right? So some studios, the engineers have no say whatsoever, right? Other studios, the engineers are completely 100% in control, right? So for example, in a studio like the Naughty Dog or the Sony Santa Monica, right? That's very engineer. I mean, it depends on the studio, right? But I would just say that you want to see how that works and if you feel comfortable with that dynamic. If this is your first job or whatever, you're not gonna know what you like, right? But it's important to understand what's going on there so that when you get into that environment, you can understand. You can better process what you're feeling. It's good to know if people think you're useless before you start, right? And there's definitely teams I've worked on where they're very disrespectful, right? But you got to understand that coming in, right? And thankfully, I did the diligence to understand that. You go in with a certain mentality, and you do the best work that you can, as always. So does a studio have studio-wide meetings? This is huge, man. Studio-wide meetings are such a big difference, I have to say, because I've worked at teams like Iron Tiger, NCSoft. I think they shuttered their doors. I think everybody got laid off, right? But they didn't have anything like that. There was no visibility into upper management. I asked to talk to the vice president. I couldn't even send her an email. It was a mess, man. That studio is dead. There's other studios where regularly, for example, when I worked on the God of War studio, the director has open office hours, just like in college, and you can go in and talk to the director and ask questions about the game. Anybody, even peon, right? Like me. So the idea is that how does the studio handle that? I think it's very telling of their culture. A company like Facebook, they don't have a team meeting. They do have team meetings, first of all. But what I mean to say is they don't only have a team meeting. They have a company-wide meeting. Mark Zuckerberg every week gets in front of the entire, 20, I don't know how many it is, right? But it's tens of thousands of Facebookers. And he talks to all of them. That is insane, right? You think Strauss, you think Mark Pincus is doing that, right? Like, I doubt it, right? There's not a lot of companies that are going to put their head on the line like that. And so that's really insane. So if a company does that, that's like really cool. And you want to see like what's the level of visibility into the big picture, right? Like, are you going to be able to get to know about a lot of stuff? Like, there's sometimes, especially if you're on a contract, like contractors really get shafted when it comes to like, oh, you can't even know what you're working on, right? And that's like, that really sucks. For me, I'm someone who really cares about like what I'm working on because the final project is a big part of what motivates me to like come in every day. So for me, that really matters. If I get stuck in like some middleware tech job, it like, I don't know, I get really bummed out. Okay, so if you're a gameplay engineer or a specific engineer, right, you're going to be curious with respect to if they have a dedicated team, right? Like, okay, I want to do AI. Do you have an AI team? Okay, if they don't, then they probably don't care about AI as much as you do. Okay, well, do they have a gameplay team with an AI guy? Like, they should be able to answer these questions, right? Sometimes they don't, right? Like, when I interviewed with the Epic Games for Fortnite, they were very dodgy with these questions. But you just have to play it by ear, right? Every company has a different level of let's say transparency. Then the other thing is, and I think this is very important. So at certain companies, the way that they progress is tied to levels, right? So, for example, you could be a level 1 engineer, level 2 engineer, and sometimes that gets split. Sometimes it doesn't. So, for example, you can be an independent contributor up until a certain point, and then you need to become a manager if you want to make more money than that. If you don't become a manager, then you're capped out, right? You can't make any more money unless you become a manager, right? And like, that's been shown to be obviously a very bad way to manage to do compensation, because you've got these amazing engineers who don't have any social skills, and you just want to stick them in a room and put them next to a keyboard, right? I mean, that's the truth of it, right? And that's why a company like Facebook is going to have two ladders where you can be an independent contributor and never talk to anybody, right? And just knock out awesome code, right? Like that's why you're gonna have someone like a John Carmack, who's like a CTO or whatever, right? But he doesn't manage people; he just works with code, right? And so the question is, does this company value ICs to the level that it's going to allow two ladders, or at one point are they going to squeeze you into people management? And are you okay with that? And what does that say about the company's values? Okay, postmortems. Does the company do them? That's a question. What does learning look like at the company? Right? There's some studios like Rockstar Games, which is not going to give a single GDC talk because they don't like sharing, right? And is that a company culture you want to be a part of? Yada yada. I think this is a great question. What's a recent argument your team had? I think that's a great question. You think of a really hard question about you, just ask that to them. Okay, cool. We're going to talk next video about programming patterns because this video is getting too long. But if this was helpful, please let me know. And if there's any way that I can help you with your process, let me know as well in the comment section. I'd be happy to help you. I really want to see everybody watching this video get their dream job, and we can make it happen. Good luck.